Mars looks like salvation, a whole new world, just waiting. Scientists talk about colonies, bases, a second home for humanity. Sounds incredible, but here's what they don't put in the press releases. Mars will try to kill you in over 30 different ways. The air will poison you, the ground is toxic, the radiation is relentless. And rescue? Rescue is 26 months away, minimum. We're going to go through every single danger, layer by layer. If this kind of brutal, eye-opening science is your thing, subscribe. You won't want to miss what's coming. Let's begin. Every astronaut who has ever trained for Mars has done it on Earth, and every single simulation has lied to them, not on purpose. The scientists running those programs are brilliant, but Earth keeps sneaking in. The gravity feels right. The air, even inside a habitat mock-up, is breathable. If something goes wrong, a doctor is 20 minutes away. If someone has a breakdown, they can walk outside. These simulations last weeks, maybe months, then everyone goes home. Mars gives you none of that. Mars gives you nothing for free. The most famous simulation is called the Hawaii Space Exploration Analog and Simulation. 6 people lived inside a dome on a Hawaiian volcano for up to a year, wearing suits every time they stepped outside, eating only shelf-stable food, limiting communication with the outside world. Sounds intense. And it was. But here is what the dome had that Mars never will. An atmosphere outside. Gravity that matches human evolution. Emergency crews camped less than a mile away. The moment a real crisis hit, the experiment could stop. On Mars, the experiment never stops. Here is the gap that keeps scientists up at night. Every simulation we have ever built protects participants from the one thing that makes Mars genuinely lethal: the environment itself. You can fake isolation. You can fake delayed communication. You can even fake the boredom and the freeze-dried meals. You cannot fake what happens to a human body when the planet surrounding your habitat wants to destroy it around the clock. Picture your school building. Now imagine the air outside is 95% carbon dioxide. The temperature outside swings from 60 degrees above zero to 200 degrees below zero within the same day. The soil under the parking lot is soaked in a chemical that eats through organic tissue. The sky above offers almost zero protection from the kind of radiation that rewrites your DNA. And the closest help is, on a good day, a radio signal that takes 24 minutes just to arrive. That is Mars on a calm Tuesday. The astronauts who trained in Antarctica come closest to understanding what prolonged isolation does to the mind. Researchers who winter over at Antarctic stations experience something called the third quarter phenomenon. Around the 2/3 mark of their stay, performance drops, mood collapses, and the crew begins fracturing socially. Scientists have tracked this pattern for decades. It is one of the most reliable psychological events in extreme isolation research. A Mars mission runs at minimum 2 to 3 years. The third quarter collapse would hit somewhere around month 14, and there would be no extraction flight, no early departure. You stay and you work through it, or the mission dies. Here is the part that makes aerospace engineers genuinely nervous. Every simulation we run removes the element of true consequence. In a dome in Hawaii, a researcher who snaps under pressure can quit. In a habitat on Mars, that same person still needs to maintain life support systems, still needs to work alongside the same 5 people, still needs to perform tasks that keep everyone alive. The psychological load of knowing there is no exit is something no simulation has ever fully replicated. Scientists are working on it. They are building better analogs, longer studies, more isolated environments. But the honest answer, the one buried in research papers most people never read, is this. We do not yet know if a human being can stay mentally functional on Mars long enough to complete a mission, and that is just the psychological side. The body has its own set of problems, starting with gravity, or rather, the brutal shortage of it. The first thing most people learn about Mars sounds almost comforting. A Martian day lasts 24 hours and 37 minutes, almost exactly the same as Earth. Early mission planners actually celebrated this. Of all the brutal differences between the two planets, at least the day length matched. Astronauts could keep their sleep schedules. Their bodies wouldn't fight the clock. That turned out to be exactly the wrong way to think about it. The 37 extra minutes do not sound like much, but your body runs on a precise internal clock called a circadian rhythm. It is built into your cells, your hormones, your digestion, your immune system. That clock was tuned over hundreds of thousands of years to match a 24-hour cycle. Shift it by even 20 minutes consistently, and the effects start showing up within weeks. Sleep quality drops, cognitive performance slides, mood regulation weakens. 37 minutes every single day, compounding. Scientists tested this on a small group of volunteers who lived on Martian time during the early Mars rover missions. Mission controllers who worked on Martian schedules reported feeling like they were in permanent jet lag. After a few weeks, several needed medical support, and they were sitting at desks in Pasadena, California. They could go home every night, eat normal food, breathe real air. Now imagine that same clock drift happening inside a sealed habitat, with no seasonal light changes, no temperature variation between rooms, no natural cues to anchor your biology. Here is where it gets stranger. Mars receives less than half the sunlight that Earth does, even on a clear day. The sky is not blue. It shifts between butterscotch yellow and dusty pink, depending on how much particulate matter floats in the atmosphere. Sunrises are blue, sunsets are blue. Everything humans associate with morning and evening is reversed from what evolution trained us to expect. Your brain uses light as its primary clock signal. Bright blue light in the morning triggers cortisol, wakes up your system, tells your body it is time to perform. Warm red light at dusk triggers melatonin, starts the sleep cycle. On Mars, the blue light comes at the wrong times. The dim, reddish ambient light during the day mimics dusk on Earth. Every day, your brain receives conflicting signals about when to be awake and when to shut down. Over months, this becomes a serious medical issue. Sleep disorders in long-duration spaceflight are already one of the most documented health problems astronauts face. Studies from International Space Station missions show that crew members sleep on average about 6 hours per night, even when given 8 hours to do so. They rely heavily on sleep aids. Their cognitive test scores show measurable declines the longer the mission runs. A Mars mission runs far longer than any space station rotation. The cruel irony is that the near-familiar day length actually makes the problem worse. If the Martian day were wildly different, 12 hours or 48 hours, mission planners would have designed around it from the start. The almost normal length created a false sense of safety. Engineers assumed adaptation would be easy. Early timeline models barely addressed it. Researchers now know that managing circadian rhythm on Mars will require precisely controlled artificial lighting, strict sleep schedules enforced by the habitat system, and possibly medication for the entire duration of the mission. One missed night of deep sleep on Earth is annoying. 50 consecutive nights of degraded sleep on Mars, with no recovery period and full mission responsibilities every morning, is a threat to the entire operation. And the clock problem is only one layer. Beneath the familiar rhythm of the day, the body is dealing with something far more physical. Gravity, or the crushing absence of enough of it, has already started its slow work. Stand up for a second. Feel the floor under your feet. That pressure, that constant pull downward, is doing something you never think about. It is keeping you alive. Every system in the human body evolved under Earth's gravity. Your heart pumps blood upward against a predictable downward force. Your bones stay dense because they carry your weight constantly. Your muscles stay strong because they fight gravity every time you take a step. Your inner ear uses gravity to tell you which way is up. Even your immune cells move through your body in patterns shaped by gravitational pull. On Mars, gravity drops to 38% of what you feel right now. That sounds like it might be manageable. It is not. The International Space Station gives us the clearest data. Astronauts living in microgravity which is even lower than Mars, lose bone density at a rate of roughly 1 to 2% per month. On Earth, elderly people with severe osteoporosis lose about 1% per year. Astronauts lose that in 30 days. By the time a 6-month space station mission ends, crew members have bones that look decades older on a scan. Mars gravity would slow this process somewhat. Scientists estimate bone loss on Mars would run around half the rate seen in orbit. Still catastrophic over a 2-year mission, a crew member arriving on Mars at peak physical health would leave with a skeleton measurably weaker than when they landed. The kind of fracture risk that normally comes with age, 60 or 70. But the bones are just the beginning. Muscle mass follows the same pattern. Without Earth-level resistance, muscles shrink fast. Astronauts on the space station exercise 2 hours every single day specifically to fight this, and they still land back on Earth barely able to walk. They need to be carried out of the capsule. Their legs, even after all that exercise, have lost too much to hold them up in full Earth gravity. A Mars crew exercising equally hard would still arrive back on Earth after a 2 to 3 year mission, with muscles so reduced that rehabilitation would take months. Some researchers believe certain crew members may never fully recover to pre-mission strength levels. The data on that is still being collected, but the early numbers are not encouraging. There is also the fluid shift problem. In low gravity, fluids in the body move toward the head. Astronauts describe a constant pressure behind their eyes, a feeling of permanent head congestion. Scans show that this fluid shift actually changes the shape of the eyeball over time. A significant number of long-duration astronauts return with measurably altered vision. Some of the changes are permanent. The visual system degradation alone could end a mission. Imagine trying to repair a life support system, read instrument panels, or perform any precise task when your vision has shifted by the equivalent of several glasses prescription changes, and you have no optometrist within 140 million miles. Mission designers know all of this. Their current answer is aggressive exercise, nutritional supplements, resistance bands, and specialized suits that simulate loading on the skeleton. These help, they do not solve the problem. The scariest part is the unknown. No human has spent 2 years in partial gravity. Every estimate about what Mars gravity does to the body over that time is based on models and extrapolation. The real numbers will only come from the mission itself. And even if the body holds together, there is something outside the habitat working on it from a different angle. The Martian atmosphere, though barely there, carries something that gets into every seal, every filter, every surface it touches. Mars has an atmosphere. That one sentence has fooled a lot of people into thinking it offers some kind of protection. It does almost nothing. The atmospheric pressure on the surface of Mars is less than 1% of what you feel standing outside right now. To put that in physical terms, the air pressure on Mars sits lower than what you would experience at the peak of Mount Everest. Then divide that by more than half again. Humans at the top of Everest are already at the absolute limit of survival without oxygen equipment. On Mars, exposed skin would experience pressure so low that fluids in the body would begin to vaporize. But here is the part that surprises most people. That near-vacuum atmosphere still causes massive problems. The thin air on Mars moves constantly. Winds regularly reach speeds of 60 to 70 miles per hour. By Earth standards, that sounds like a serious storm, close to hurricane force. On Mars, because the air is so thin, a 70-mile-per-hour wind carries almost no physical force. It would feel like a light breeze pushing against your hand. So winds that sound dangerous are physically harmless. That sounds like good news. It is the opposite. Those same winds, weak as they feel, are powerful enough to lift and carry the finest dust particles on the planet. And Martian dust is unlike anything on Earth. Earth's soil has been tumbled and smoothed by water, by biological processes, by billions of years of weathering. Martian dust has been ground by wind and radiation into particles so fine and sharp they are closer to microscopic glass shards than to sand. This dust gets everywhere. It coats solar panels and reduces their power output. It works into mechanical joints and grinds them down. It settles on every surface inside an airlock every time a crew member returns from outside. Space agencies have already watched Mars rovers lose significant power as dust accumulates on their panels over months. The Opportunity rover, built to last 90 days, survived 14 years, but dust management was a constant battle that drove mission controllers to celebrate whenever a wind gust cleared the panels. For human crew members, the dust problem is personal. Suits returning from the surface carry dust inside the airlock. Repeated exposure means repeated contact, and Martian dust carries a chemical called perchlorate, which we will cover in detail later. But the physical act of dust infiltration alone is a serious engineering problem that no team has fully solved yet. There is also the problem of dust and visibility. A heavy dust day on Mars reduces visibility to a few hundred feet. Critical equipment parked outside the habitat becomes inaccessible during peak conditions. Surface operations, building, repairing, exploring, stop entirely. The atmosphere offers none of the radiation protection Earth's thick air provides, none of the thermal insulation, none of the acoustic transmission that makes sound travel at normal distances. The thin air on Mars means that a large explosion 100 feet away sounds roughly like someone clapping their hands near you. Sound barely carries. That is deeply disorienting for human beings who rely on audio cues for spatial awareness and safety alerts. A habitat alarm that would be ear-splitting on Earth becomes a soft tone on Mars's surface. Engineers are already rethinking every audio warning system for surface operations. And all of this, every dust particle, every pressure difference, every muffled sound, is on a calm day. When Mars decides to have a bad season, the dust does not just float, it swallows the planet whole. The dust on Mars is patient. It does not rush. It does not announce itself. It simply gets into everything, and then it starts to win. Scientists first got a close look at what Martian dust actually is when early rovers began sending back soil analysis data. The results were unexpected. The particles were far finer than anticipated, some smaller than a single human red blood cell. They carried sharp, irregular edges, because nothing on Mars had ever rounded them off. No ocean waves, no rivers, no biological decay. Just wind and radiation grinding rock for billions of years, producing something closer to powdered glass than to dirt. On Earth, dust settles. It follows gravity, lands on surfaces, and sits there until something moves it. On Mars, the combination of low gravity and persistent winds means dust stays suspended in the atmosphere for weeks after a storm. It hangs in the air like fog that refuses to clear. During the worst seasons, a fine haze of particles remains in the Martian sky for months. The mechanical damage starts immediately. Every moving part on a surface vehicle or habitat exterior faces constant abrasion. Seals that should last years begin showing wear in months. Joints that open and close smoothly on Earth start to catch and grind. Scientists running Mars rover missions discovered early on that dust was their biggest enemy, more damaging over time than radiation, extreme temperatures, or any single weather event. For human colonists, the dust threat becomes personal in two specific ways. The first is the suit. Every time an astronaut walks on the surface and returns to the habitat, their suit is coated in dust. The airlock process is designed to contain this, but fine particles defeat most containment systems. Studies show that lunar dust, which behaves similarly, found its way inside Apollo habitats despite every precaution. Apollo astronaut Harrison Schmitt developed what he described as hay fever symptoms within hours of returning to the lunar module, triggered by dust exposure inside the cabin. Mars dust carries an additional chemical threat beyond the physical sharpness of the particles. Perchlorate compounds exist throughout the Martian soil, and they bind to dust particles, meaning any dust that makes it inside the habitat is also delivering a toxic chemical payload. We will go deeper on perchlorate shortly, but the combination of sharp particles and chemical contamination makes Martian dust one of the most dangerous chronic threats a crew will face. The second personal threat is to the power supply. A Mars colony in its early years will depend almost entirely on solar panels for electricity. Dust accumulation on panels is a slow, constant drain. Without regular cleaning, panels lose efficiency steadily. During a regional dust storm, panels can lose the majority of their output within days. Robotic cleaning systems are being designed, but they add mechanical complexity and failure points. A crew manually cleaning panels during even light wind conditions risks soot contamination, and in a heavy storm, surface operations become impossible. The Spirit rover lost its mission in 2010 when a dust storm cut its solar power below the threshold needed to survive a Martian winter. It simply ran out of energy with no way to recharge. A human habitat facing the same scenario would be looking at a heating system failure, then life support failure, in a matter of hours. The dust does not care about timelines. It does not care about launch windows or mission objectives. It accumulates while the crew sleeps, while they eat, while they work. And when Mars decides to stop being subtle, it sends something so large it can be seen from space. In 2018, something extraordinary happened. A dust storm grew on Mars and kept growing. It started as a regional event, the kind that Martian weather produces several times a year. Then it expanded. Within weeks, it had spread across the entire planet. It blotted out the sun. It turned the Martian sky from its usual pale orange into a thick, dark curtain that blocked nearly all direct sunlight from reaching the surface. It lasted for months. The Opportunity rover, which had already survived 14 years on a planet designed to kill machines, went silent. Scientists sent signals. Nothing came back. Weeks passed, then months. In early 2019, after sending over 1,000 signals with no response, the mission was declared over. The storm had starved Opportunity's solar panels of sunlight long enough that the rover's batteries drained completely and the internal temperature dropped low enough to destroy critical systems. A machine died. Now imagine a human crew inside a habitat when the same kind of storm arrives. Global dust storms on Mars happen at irregular intervals, most commonly during the Martian southern summer when the planet is closest to the sun, and temperature differences between regions drive massive atmospheric circulation. They can develop from regional storms into planet-wide events within days, sometimes within hours. Scientists cannot yet reliably predict when a global storm will form. The data from orbit gives warning, but sometimes only a short window before conditions become extreme. The power crisis begins almost immediately. A habitat relying on solar panels would see output drop dramatically within the first days of a large regional storm. During a global storm, that output can fall to near zero. Without electricity, heating stops. The interior temperature of a Mars habitat would begin falling toward the outside temperature, which regularly reaches 100 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit overnight. A nuclear power source would solve the energy problem. Some mission designs include small reactors for exactly this reason. But nuclear systems carry their own risks, require specialized operation, and add enormous cost and logistical complexity to missions already operating at the edge of what is physically possible to launch from Earth. The crew stuck inside during a global storm faces something beyond the immediate survival math. A storm lasting 2 to 3 months means months of confinement within the habitat. Surface operations, which are essential for scientific work, equipment maintenance, and psychological health, stop entirely. The same small group of people is locked inside the same walls for months with no external activity, dwindling power margins, and no timeline for when conditions will improve. The psychological data from Antarctic winter over studies shows that extended confinement, even with full power and ample food, produces significant mental health effects after a few weeks. A global dust storm on Mars stacks confinement on top of power stress, on top of the baseline psychological load of already being millions of miles from Earth. Mission planners are working on storm-resilient habitat designs, redundant power systems, and emergency protocols for exactly this scenario. But every added system adds weight, and weight is the cruelest constraint in space travel. Every pound sent to Mars costs roughly the price of a luxury car to launch. Compromises happen, and in a storm, every compromised system is a potential failure point. The dust and the darkness are manageable, with enough preparation. What pours through that same thin atmosphere every second of every day, storm or no storm, is something no amount of engineering can negotiate with. It comes from the sun, and it never stops. On Earth, you are constantly being bombarded by radiation from space. You just never feel it, because the planet is protecting you. Earth's magnetic field extends tens of thousands of miles into space and deflects the most dangerous particles away from the surface. The thick atmosphere absorbs most of what gets through. By the time any radiation reaches you standing outside on a sunny day, it has been reduced to levels your body handles without any issue. You do not think about it. You do not need to. Mars has no global magnetic field. Whatever field it once had died billions of years ago when its core cooled and stopped generating the electromagnetic shield Earth still has today. The Martian atmosphere, thin as it is, provides a fraction of the protection Earth's air layer offers. The surface of Mars sits essentially exposed. The Curiosity rover carried a radiation detector during its journey to Mars, and while operating on the surface, the data it sent back changed how scientists think about Mars missions. A crew member making the 6 to 7 month trip to Mars, spending time on the surface, then making the return trip would absorb a radiation dose that current estimates place between 5 to 7 times the annual limit set for professional nuclear power plant workers. Workers who spend their entire careers managing the most radiation-heavy civilian jobs on Earth. The radiation on Mars comes from two main sources. The first is cosmic rays, high-energy particles fired across the galaxy from ancient supernovae and other extreme events that travel for thousands of light years before slamming into whatever gets in their way. On Mars's surface, your body is in their way. The second source is solar particle events. Massive eruptions from the sun that fire concentrated waves of radiation outward through the solar system. On Earth, these events cause beautiful auroras and occasionally disrupt satellite communications. On Mars, without a magnetic shield, a major solar particle event can deliver a radiation dose in hours that would cause acute radiation sickness. In the most extreme cases, which do happen, the dose can be lethal within days. The advance warning time for a solar particle event is short. Scientists monitoring the sun can sometimes provide warnings of 30 minutes to an hour before the radiation wave arrives. A crew on the Martian surface during a moderate event has enough time to get inside the habitat and move to a shielded area. A crew caught in a pressurized rover several miles from the base during a major event has a far more serious problem. Long-term radiation exposure on Mars increases cancer risk significantly. Current projections suggest that crew members on a multi-year Mars mission would accept a cancer risk increase that most space agencies classify as career-limiting under current safety guidelines. That means the rules designed to protect astronauts working in Earth's orbit would need to be rewritten specifically for Mars missions to allow crews to go at all. Some researchers are working on radiation shielding materials. Polyethylene, a plastic, actually blocks certain types of radiation better than lead. Habitat walls filled with water provide excellent shielding. Underground habitats carved into the Martian rock would offer substantial protection. All of these help. None of them eliminate the problem. And even inside the best shielded habitat, every trip to the surface, every rover excursion, every emergency repair that requires going outside adds to the lifetime total. The radiation is not a one-time event. It is a budget, and on Mars, every day spends a little more of it. The radiation pours in from above, but what waits in the ground, directly beneath the habitat, is a different kind of threat entirely. One that came as a genuine shock to the scientists who found it. For years, scientists debated whether life could exist on Mars. The discovery that changed the conversation came in 2008 from a lander called Phoenix, sitting in the Martian Arctic. Phoenix dug into the Martian soil and analyzed what it found. The results surprised almost everyone. The soil contained perchlorate compounds at levels between 0.5% and 1% by weight. To put that in physical terms, roughly 1 in every 100 grains of Martian soil contains a chemical that, in the concentrations found, is toxic to human biology. Perchlorate is a real molecule found on Earth too, mostly in desert regions where similar chemical reactions occur. On Earth, it is classified as a hazardous substance. It interferes with the thyroid gland, which controls a significant portion of your body's hormone system. Prolonged exposure disrupts metabolism, immune function, and in children causes developmental problems. Industrial sites that contaminate soil with perchlorate face mandatory cleanup orders. On Mars, it is everywhere. Every surface sample taken since the Phoenix discovery has confirmed it across multiple landing sites, from the equator to the poles. The Martian soil is globally contaminated with this compound. For a Mars colony, the perchlorate problem attacks from several directions at once. The soil itself cannot be touched with bare skin, ever. Any dust that enters the habitat carries perchlorate particles. Food grown in Martian soil would require extensive processing to bring perchlorate levels down to safe thresholds, and even then the risk of accumulation over years of eating Mars-grown food is something scientists are still calculating. The processing challenge is enormous. Washing soil with water removes perchlorate, but that process requires significant water supplies, which Mars colonies will not have in abundance during early operations. Specialized bacteria that consume perchlorate exist on Earth and are being studied as a potential soil remediation tool. But releasing Earth bacteria into Martian soil raises planetary protection issues that space agencies have debated for decades without resolution. There is also a thermal irony buried in the perchlorate problem. At high temperatures, perchlorate compounds release oxygen gas and become even more reactive. Mars receives ultraviolet radiation at levels far exceeding Earth's surface due to the thin atmosphere. Scientists believe this ultraviolet exposure, combined with the perchlorates in the dust, creates a photochemically reactive surface layer. Testing has shown that this reactive surface layer destroys organic molecules, including bacteria, extremely efficiently. That means the surface of Mars may be more hostile to any Earth life, bacterial or human, than scientists initially thought. The toxicity is not passive, it is actively destructive to biological material. Underground habitats avoid direct soil contact, but do not eliminate the perchlorate threat as long as surface operations continue. Every crew member returning from outside brings contaminated dust back into the airlock. Every mechanical system that interacts with the surface becomes a vector for contamination. The habitat itself must be treated as a clean zone that requires constant maintenance to stay clean. And beneath the toxicity and the radiation and the dust, there is a silence that compounds everything. A silence born from the 24-minute gap between Mars and the only civilization capable of helping you. Imagine something goes wrong. A pipe bursts inside the habitat, pressure starts dropping, or someone collapses with symptoms nobody recognizes, or a solar panel array takes damage and power begins failing. Your first instinct is to call for help. On Mars, you pick up the communication system and transmit your message. Then you wait. Between 3 and 24 minutes, depending on where Earth and Mars sit in their orbits, your signal takes just to reach Earth. Then the engineers on the ground need time to assess the situation. Then their response travels back. On a good day, you wait 45 minutes for an answer. On a bad day, the round trip takes close to an hour. That is not a communication inconvenience. That is a complete restructuring of how emergencies work. Every scenario that requires immediate decision-making falls entirely to the crew. A medical emergency where someone stops breathing needs a response in minutes. Mission control cannot participate in real time. The flight surgeon watching the data feed on Earth knows that by the time they see the alert, the outcome is already determined. The crew lives or dies based on what they do in those first few minutes, with whatever knowledge and equipment they have on hand. This is why Mars mission designers are moving toward a model where the crew has extreme levels of autonomy, essentially complete decision-making authority for all time-critical situations. On space station missions, crew members check with the ground before making significant operational decisions. On Mars, that model breaks completely. The crew must think independently, act independently, and live with the consequences of decisions made without expert guidance. Psychologically, that autonomy is both empowering and crushing. Studies of Antarctic expedition teams and submarine crews show that groups operating under sustained isolation develop a particular kind of stress response tied to the awareness that external rescue is impossible. The knowledge that you are the last line of defense, not just for yourself, but for every person in the habitat, creates a chronic background anxiety that compounds over months. The communication delay also affects the most basic human need for connection. Video calls with family, friends, and support teams experience that same delay. A conversation becomes a slow exchange of messages rather than an actual dialogue. You speak, you wait, you hear a response that was recorded before you finish talking. Early astronauts on long missions describe the communication delay as one of the most psychologically difficult aspects of being far from Earth. Crew members on the International Space Station can video call family members in near real time. They can watch news as it happens. They can feel connected to the world below. A Mars crew experiences Earth as something that happened in the past. Every piece of news, every personal update, every message from a loved one describes a moment that is already 15 to 24 minutes old by the time it arrives. For mission operations, the delay reshapes everything. Software updates from Earth engineers cannot be applied in real time during a system failure. Troubleshooting guidance arrives after the immediate crisis has already demanded a response. The crew becomes the ground team, the flight controllers, the medical staff, and the engineers all at once. Training programs are beginning to simulate this. Crews in analog missions now practice communication blackout periods, where they receive no guidance from outside for days or weeks. The psychological adjustment required is substantial, and even in those simulations, everyone knows the blackout is artificial and safety crews are standing by. On Mars, the blackout is real, it is permanent, and there are no safety crews standing by. And somewhere in the middle of managing all of that, the crew still needs to eat. A Mars crew cannot bring enough food for a 3-year mission. The numbers make it physically impossible. A single person needs roughly 5 pounds of food per day to maintain body weight and cognitive function under high-stress conditions. 6 crew members over 3 years require more than 30,000 pounds of food. Launching 30,000 pounds from Earth to Mars currently costs, at conservative estimates, somewhere in the range of billions of dollars. And that is assuming perfect launch efficiency, which does not exist. So the mission grows food. That was always part of the plan. But growing food on Mars turns out to be one of the most complex problems in the entire mission profile, combining soil chemistry, water availability, radiation exposure, and the fundamental biology of plants under low gravity and artificial light. The first obstacle is the soil. Martian regolith, the loose surface material covering most of the planet, is not soil in any agricultural sense. Soil on Earth is alive. It contains billions of microorganisms per teaspoon that break down organic matter, cycle nutrients, and create the conditions plants need to thrive. Martian regolith is sterile, chemically hostile, and loaded with perchlorate. Plants placed directly into Martian regolith without significant processing would die within days from chemical toxicity alone. Scientists working on this problem propose a multi-step solution. First, wash the regolith extensively with water to leach out perchlorates. Then introduce Earth microbes specifically selected to begin building biological activity in the soil. Then add organic matter from crew waste, food scraps, and plant debris to build something that begins functioning like real soil. The timeline for this process, in the most optimistic projections, runs to several years of sustained effort before the soil reaches genuine agricultural productivity. In the first years of a Mars colony, nearly all food production would happen in controlled hydroponic or aeroponic systems, where plants grow in nutrient-rich water solutions without soil. These systems are already used on Earth and work well under controlled conditions. NASA has grown lettuce on the International Space Station using similar methods, but a hydroponic system large enough to supplement a crew's caloric needs requires extensive infrastructure, significant power for lighting, and a constant supply of water and nutrients. The caloric math is particularly sobering. The crops most efficiently grown in controlled environments, leafy greens, herbs, some root vegetables, are low in calories. A crew member doing physical labor in a Mars habitat needs roughly 3,000 calories per day. Lettuce and spinach provide almost none of that. The calorie-dense crops, potatoes, wheat, legumes, require more space, more time, and more complex growing conditions. Potatoes have been studied seriously as a Mars crop, partly inspired by fictional portrayals, but backed by genuine agricultural research. Scientists grew potato varieties in conditions mimicking Martian soil composition, with the perchlorate removed, and achieved partial success. The plants grew, the yield was significantly lower than Earth agriculture, and the energy cost of the lighting and water systems made the actual caloric return on investment quite low compared to simply shipping the food from Earth. The honest assessment from agricultural scientists studying this problem is that food production on Mars in a first-generation colony would provide a supplement to ship supplies, not a replacement for them. A crew that loses its supply chain from Earth before achieving food self-sufficiency faces starvation within months, and the supply chain is about to get much more complicated to discuss. Mars has water, a lot of it, by some estimates. Scientists using orbital radar instruments have mapped subsurface ice deposits that span areas the size of small U.S. states. Near the poles, water ice sits close enough to the surface that rovers have scraped it up in the form of frost. Even the thin Martian atmosphere holds trace amounts of water vapor. The headlines announcing these discoveries were triumphant. Water on Mars means life support. Water means drinking, growing food, and, crucially, making rocket fuel for a return trip. The problem was buried in the technical details. Most headlines skipped. Getting that water out of the ground and into usable form requires energy, infrastructure, and equipment that does not yet exist on Mars. And building that infrastructure is nearly as complex as building the habitat itself. The most accessible water ice sits at the poles, where temperatures stay cold enough to keep ice stable near the surface. But proposed landing sites for human missions are generally not at the poles. The polar regions of Mars present extreme cold, limited sunlight for solar power, and terrain that complicates landing and surface operations. The ice that is most accessible is also the ice that is hardest to reach safely. At mid-latitude landing sites, water ice exists but sits deeper underground, sometimes many feet below the surface. Extracting it requires drilling, which requires heavy equipment, which requires significant power, which requires either a large solar array, a nuclear reactor, or both. The ice also needs to be heated and processed to remove contaminants before it is safe to drink or use in life support systems. Scientists have proposed several extraction methods. One approach heats the ground using a large dome placed on the surface, allowing water vapor to rise and be collected. Another drills directly into ice-rich layers and pumps out the melt. Both methods have been tested in Earth laboratories. Neither has been demonstrated on Mars. The water budget for a 6-person crew is significant. Drinking water, food preparation, hygiene, growing crops, and manufacturing rocket fuel all compete for the same limited supply. Recycling systems used on the International Space Station already recover around 93% of water from humidity, urine, and other sources. Mars missions would need systems approaching 100% recovery with near-zero loss, a technical standard that does not yet exist in a reliable form. Making rocket fuel from water adds another layer. Splitting water into hydrogen and oxygen gas using electricity, a process called electrolysis, is well understood chemistry. But running an electrolysis plant large enough to manufacture meaningful quantities of fuel requires enormous amounts of power running continuously over months. That power demand must be met on top of every other energy need the colony has. The fuel manufacturing timeline projected in the most optimistic mission scenarios runs to over a year of continuous operation before enough propellant exists for a return launch. A year of fuel production assumes nothing breaks down, nothing gets contaminated, power stays consistent, water extraction meets projections. Every one of those assumptions represents a failure point, and a crew that cannot make enough fuel cannot go home. The water is there. Turning it into survival is the mission within the mission. The physical challenges of water, food, radiation, and dust are measurable problems with engineering solutions in progress. The next threat is one that engineering cannot easily quantify. It lives inside the crew. In 1982, a Soviet researcher named Anatoly Berezovoy arrived at the Soviet space station Salyut 7 for what was planned as a long-duration mission. He spent 211 days in space, which was a record at the time. His diary entries, later made public, describe a predictable emotional arc: early excitement, adaptation, competence. Then, somewhere past the halfway mark, a quiet erosion that he described as feeling like the walls were slowly pressing inward, not physically, but psychologically. He made it through. He functioned. The mission succeeded. But his account matched dozens of others collected from cosmonauts, astronauts, Antarctic researchers, and submarine crews studied over the following decades. The pattern was consistent enough that researchers gave it a name: the third quarter phenomenon. Around 2/3 of the way through any long-duration isolated mission, performance metrics drop, interpersonal tension rises, sleep worsens, and motivation collapses. The initial psychological momentum that carries people through hard early stages runs out. The end of the mission feels close enough to crave, but far enough to feel impossible. Time distortion becomes severe. Days feel identical. Purpose becomes harder to feel. For a Mars mission, the third quarter collapse would arrive somewhere around month 12 to 14 of a roughly 24 to 36-month surface stay. The crew would be deep into their mission, physically weakened by low gravity and radiation accumulation, running on recycled air and freeze-dried food, and experiencing something that decades of research says is nearly unavoidable. Antarctic winter over crews describe a specific symptom called the long eye, a flat, distant look that settles over people who have been isolated too long. Colleagues begin communicating in shorter exchanges. Jokes stop landing. Small irritations become significant conflicts. Groups that were functioning cohesively begin to fracture along personality fault lines that were invisible in the first months. A team of 6 people in a habitat the size of a large house, with no ability to get away from each other, no privacy beyond a sleeping pod, and no end to the close quarters in sight, will experience these dynamics in concentrated form. Research from Antarctic stations shows that confined groups often split into subgroups, sometimes between crew who were close friends before the mission began. Mission designers are now treating crew psychology as a primary engineering problem rather than a secondary support issue. Habitat design includes private sleep areas, common spaces designed to feel distinct from work areas, and color and lighting systems designed to create psychological variety in an environment with no exterior windows. Crew selection has moved towards specific psychological profiles identified through years of isolation studies. Traits like emotional stability under monotony, conflict resolution skills, and the ability to maintain personal routines are now weighted heavily in selection processes. Some researchers argue these factors matter more than technical skills, since technical skills can be trained, but personality cannot be fundamentally changed. None of these measures eliminate the third quarter collapse. The research indicates they reduce its severity and duration. The goal is to get the crew through it functional, not to prevent it entirely. And then, past the psychological valley, on the other side of month 14, the crew faces something the body experiences as a daily assault, a temperature swing so extreme that the materials holding the habitat together are constantly being tested to their limits. Every morning on Mars, the temperature starts somewhere between 100 and 130 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit. By mid-afternoon, the surface near the equator can reach a relatively mild 45 to 60 degrees above zero. Then, as the sun drops, the temperature falls again. Within hours of sunset, it is back below 100 degrees below zero. That swing, roughly 170 to 200 degrees Fahrenheit, over the course of a single day, happens every single day on Mars, for the entire duration of a mission. On Earth, buildings experience seasonal temperature changes, and they show wear over decades. Concrete expands and contracts. Metal joints develop stress fractures over years of thermal cycling. Engineers design around this by using flexible materials, expansion joints, and engineering tolerances that account for movement. A building in Minnesota deals with perhaps 60 to 70 degrees of temperature variation between its coldest winter night and its hottest summer day. A Mars habitat cycles through 2 to 3 times that range every 24 hours. The thermal stress on a habitat structure operating under these conditions is extraordinary. Every connection point, every seal, every fastener, every pipe junction expands when the temperature rises and contracts when it falls. Repeating this process every single day for 2 years means repeating it over 700 times over the course of a mission. Materials that seem robust under static testing develop fatigue behavior under repeated cycling that can be difficult to predict precisely. The seals on a Mars habitat carry a particular burden. They must maintain pressure differential between the interior and the exterior atmosphere at all times, even as the temperature around them swings by 200 degrees daily. A seal that fails means pressure loss. Pressure loss means air loss. Air loss on Mars is not something you patch and move on from. It is a countdown. Mission designers use multiple redundant sealing systems and materials selected specifically for their thermal stability across extreme ranges. Aerogel insulation, the same material used in some Mars rovers, provides excellent thermal protection in thin layers. Heat shields and active heating systems keep interior temperatures stable, even when the outside drops to depths that would freeze most Earth materials solid. But active heating requires power, constant power, running every night without interruption for the entire mission. A power failure on a Martian night does not produce discomfort. It produces temperatures inside the habitat that, without heat, would fall toward the exterior within hours. The physical margin between a functioning heating system and a habitat that begins approaching lethal cold is narrow enough to make engineers lose sleep. The thermal cycling also accelerates the degradation of solar panels, mechanical systems, and the habitat exterior. Equipment rated for a 5-year lifespan under Earth conditions may reach its operational limits faster on Mars simply from the daily physical stress of expansion and contraction. Maintenance schedules have to account for this, which means more surface time for the crew, which means more radiation exposure and dust contact. Everything on Mars costs more than it costs anywhere else, including staying warm. And the most personal cost of all, the one that arrives without warning and allows almost no margin for error, is what happens when a suit fails. You are 300 feet from the habitat. You are checking an external sensor array when your suit displays a pressure warning. A micrometeorite, smaller than a grain of rice, has punched through the outer layer of your glove. The breach is tiny, roughly the diameter of a pencil tip. You have about 2 minutes, maybe less. The human body can survive brief exposure to near vacuum conditions. Films frequently depict explosive, dramatic decompression where someone exposed to space instantly explodes or freezes. The reality is different, and in some ways more frightening, because it is slow enough to experience fully. In the first seconds after a breach, the air inside the suit begins escaping through the hole. Pressure drops. Your body responds immediately. The moisture on the surface of your eyes and tongue begins to vaporize, a process called ebullition, because your body fluids, at normal temperature, require external pressure to stay liquid. You feel a tingling across every exposed surface. Your saliva boils on your tongue, which is not painful in the way burning is painful, but is deeply disorienting. As pressure continues dropping, the oxygen level in your suit falls. Within 30 seconds to a minute, you begin losing cognitive function. The first symptom is not pain, it is confusion. You may not immediately understand what is happening or what you need to do. Your hands, which need to seal the breach or activate a suit emergency protocol, may feel disconnected from your intentions. Between 60 and 90 seconds, consciousness becomes unreliable. You may lose it entirely. If you have not initiated a rescue protocol, sealed the breach, or begun moving toward the habitat, your window for self-rescue is closing rapidly. At approximately 2 minutes of full pressure loss, the damage to the brain from oxygen deprivation begins crossing into the range associated with lasting neurological injury. Survival beyond this point requires another crew member to reach you, drag you to the airlock, cycle through pressure, and begin resuscitation within a window that continues narrowing every second. Mars suits in current development feature multiple redundant pressure systems, automatic breach sealing mechanisms, and emergency beacons. They are designed to buy time. A small breach in the outer layer triggers a sealant mechanism while the inner pressure suit maintains integrity. The designs are significantly more sophisticated than the suits used during the Apollo missions. But no engineering solution is perfect. Redundant systems add weight. Weight affects mobility. A suit heavy enough to survive every failure scenario is a suit that limits the physical ability of the crew member wearing it. Every design involves trade-offs between protection and function, and those trade-offs happen in conference rooms on Earth, not on the surface of Mars where the consequences land. The suits also degrade. Every surface excursion abrades the outer layers with fine dust. Every thermal cycle stresses the materials. A suit that passed every certification test before launch may not perform identically after 400 surface excursions over 2 years on a planet that grinds everything down. This is why every surface operation on Mars, every single one, will require a second crew member within immediate reach. Surface work alone is prohibited in every mission protocol currently in development. The backup is always part of the plan. And yet every plan has to account for a scenario where the backup is the one who needs help. The suit is the last line of defense between the crew and the environment. The next hardest wall surrounding the mission is not physical, it is temporal. Because leaving Mars is not something you can do on demand. Earth and Mars travel around the Sun at different speeds. Earth takes 1 year to complete an orbit. Mars takes roughly 1 year and 10 months. This means the two planets align in a favorable position for travel only once approximately every 26 months. Miss that window, and the next one is over 2 years away. For an unmanned spacecraft, a missed launch window is a scheduling problem. For a crewed mission, it is a life or death constraint that shapes every decision made from the moment the mission launches. Once a crew lands on Mars, they are committed to staying until the next launch window opens, assuming everything goes right with their return vehicle. There is no early departure option, no emergency extraction, no rescue mission that could arrive faster than the orbital mechanics allow. The implication of this is profound. A crew that lands on Mars in poor health has to recover on Mars. A crew facing a life-threatening medical emergency cannot be evacuated. A mission that begins falling apart due to equipment failure, psychological breakdown, or loss of a crew member continues until the launch window opens, regardless of conditions on the surface. Mission planners call this the commit point. Once the crew passes a certain moment in the mission timeline, turning back costs more time and fuel than continuing forward. Past the commit point, the crew is going to Mars. They are staying until the window opens, and they are coming home on the schedule the planets set, not the schedule humans prefer. The 26-month gap also governs the supply chain from Earth. Resupply missions can only launch during these same windows. If a colony runs critically low on a key supply between windows, there is no emergency resupply flight. The crew must stretch what they have or do without it. Mission designers build in supply margins, but every extra pound of contingency supplies is a pound of science equipment, spare parts, or medical supplies that did not make the flight. The launch window constraint also creates a particular kind of psychological pressure that few people outside of mission planning fully appreciate. From the day a crew lands, everyone knows the exact date of the launch window, down to the hour. That date sits at the edge of every decision, every timeline, every resource allocation. Every repair takes time away from mission objectives. Every illness shifts the workload. Every piece of equipment that fails moves the crew closer to a launch date they cannot miss with a vehicle that must be ready. Astronauts who have spoken about long-duration mission planning describe the awareness of the launch window as a constant background presence, not exactly anxiety, but a permanent temporal context for every activity. On a space station, a crew member who becomes seriously ill can be evacuated in hours in an emergency Soyuz capsule. On Mars, that crew member must be stabilized, treated, and kept alive until an aligned orbit allows departure. The return vehicle itself is the most constrained element of the entire mission. It has to work. Every piece of it has to work on the day the window opens. And making that vehicle work requires fuel. Fuel that has to be manufactured on the surface of Mars using technology never before operated on another planet. What comes next in understanding Mars survival goes inward, because while the planet attacks from outside, the body is simultaneously dismantling itself from the inside in ways that take months to fully measure. Astronaut Scott Kelly returned from 340 days on the International Space Station in 2016. He landed in Kazakhstan and was helped out of his Soyuz capsule by recovery crews. At 6'1" and physically conditioned to an elite level, he still could not walk unassisted for the first several hours after landing. His legs, even after following the most rigorous exercise protocols ever designed for a long-duration mission, had lost too much to hold him up in Earth gravity. Kelly spent months in rehabilitation. Some of the changes to his body from that single mission took over a year to reverse. Some still have not fully reversed. A Mars mission runs at minimum 3 times the length of Kelly's stay in orbit, and Mars gravity, while greater than the zero gravity of the space station, provides only 38% of the load a human skeleton was built to carry. The bone loss that follows is different from what happens in zero gravity, but it does not stop. It simply progresses more slowly toward the same destination. Bone is living tissue. It constantly breaks down and rebuilds itself in a process called remodeling. Under Earth gravity, mechanical loading from walking, lifting, and simple movement signals the body to keep rebuilding at a rate that matches or exceeds the breakdown. Remove that loading or reduce it significantly, and the balance shifts. Breakdown outpaces rebuilding. Bone density falls. In low gravity or zero gravity, astronauts lose bone mass primarily in the lower body. The pelvis, femur, and lower spine, the bones that carry the most load during normal Earth movement, are the same ones that experience the least stress in reduced gravity. Without the signal of weight-bearing movement, the body begins treating those bones as resources to be reclaimed. Calcium leaches out. The internal structure, which under a microscope looks like a dense scaffold, begins losing struts. The calcium that leaves the bones goes somewhere. It enters the bloodstream and eventually the kidneys. Astronauts on long missions face elevated kidney stone risk for exactly this reason. The kidneys are processing more calcium than they were designed to handle for extended periods. Exercise is the primary countermeasure. Resistance exercise, where the body pushes against significant weight, provides the loading signal the bones need. Mars missions include extensive exercise equipment designed specifically to simulate Earth-level loading forces. The advanced resistive exercise device used on the space station allows crew members to work against loads equivalent to 600 pounds, replicating the kind of forces the skeleton experiences during heavy physical activity on Earth. 2 hours of prescribed exercise per day is the current standard for space station crews. Mars crews would follow similar or more intensive protocols. The exercise works. It dramatically slows the bone loss compared to missions without it. But it does not eliminate the loss entirely, and it consumes 2 hours of every crew member's day that could be spent on science, maintenance, or rest. The frightening unknown is what a 24 to 36-month partial gravity exposure does to bone structure in ways that have never been observed. Every astronaut who has spent significant time in space has done so in zero gravity, not partial gravity. The Mars scenario is physically different in ways that make direct extrapolation from existing data uncertain. Scientists are building models. The real numbers will require sending people to Mars and measuring what happens. Some researchers believe that certain crew members may return from Mars, unable to function fully in Earth gravity for the rest of their lives. Their bones, their cardiovascular system, and their muscle architecture may have adapted to a 38% gravity world in ways that cannot be fully reversed. A planet that costs you your ability to live on your home world in exchange for visiting it is a different kind of commitment than any humans have ever made before. And as if the body's silent collapse were not enough, Mars adds one more layer of sensory strangeness to the experience, one that the body was never built to handle. Stand outside on a clear morning on Earth. The sky shifts from deep purple to orange to brilliant blue within minutes of the sun coming up. The blue light hits your eyes, and inside your body, a cascade of chemistry begins. Cortisol rises. Your brain shifts into alert mode. Serotonin production increases. Your internal clock receives a powerful signal that the day has started and it is time to function. That signal has been calibrated into human biology over hundreds of thousands of years. It is ancient, it is precise, and on Mars, it runs completely backward. Martian sunrises are blue. The fine dust particles suspended in the atmosphere scatter sunlight differently than Earth's air does, concentrating the blue wavelengths around the sun at the horizon during sunrise and sunset. The middle of the Martian day, when the sun sits overhead, produces a sky that shifts between pale orange, butterscotch yellow, and a washed-out pink, depending on dust levels and season. So the blue light that tells your brain it is morning arrives at the wrong time, right at the horizon when the sun is just coming up. During what should be the most alerting part of the day, the overhead sky is dim, orange-tinted, and low stimulation. The signal your body receives all day is similar to what you would experience during late afternoon on Earth, a time when your biology naturally begins preparing for wind down and rest. This sustained, dim orange light environment across the Martian day means the visual stimulation that keeps humans alert, focused, and emotionally stable is significantly reduced compared to what evolution built humans to require. Research on seasonal affective disorder, a condition where reduced light during winter months produces depression-like symptoms in millions of people on Earth, gives a baseline for what happens when humans are deprived of adequate bright light exposure. The symptoms include fatigue, cognitive slowing, mood depression, and disrupted sleep. On Mars, the effect would run continuously without seasonal recovery. The light environment does not return to normal in spring. It stays dim and orange-tinted every day of the mission. Habitat designers are incorporating full-spectrum artificial lighting systems that can simulate Earth's natural light progression, bright blue-white morning light transitioning to warmer, dimmer tones in the evening. These systems have shown effectiveness in clinical research for treating seasonal affective disorder and in work environments where natural light is absent, such as Arctic research stations during polar night. The systems work, but they require electricity, running constantly, competing with life support, heating, food production systems, and every other power demand the habitat carries. Lighting is always one of the systems that gets examined during power budget reviews for exactly this reason. There is also a subtler effect that no artificial lighting system fully replicates. On Earth, your sense of time is anchored not just by light quality, but by the movement of the sun across the sky, the changing angle of shadows, the visual progression from bright to dim to dark that your brain tracks unconsciously across every waking hour. Inside a habitat with artificial lighting, even the best system produces a static simulation of that progression. The depth of environmental time cues that humans take for granted simply does not exist inside a sealed habitat. After months of living under artificial light on an alien world with no exterior windows in the living areas, crew members would experience a form of sensory monotony so complete that researchers studying long-duration mission psychology classify it as a distinct threat to cognitive performance, separate from isolation, separate from workload stress, and separate from the third quarter phenomenon. The eyes and the brain want something real, something that changes organically, something that feels like a world rather than a building. And on Mars, that feeling is something the crew may not experience for years. Close your eyes for a second. Listen to whatever is around you right now. Traffic, maybe, someone talking nearby. The hum of a building, air moving through vents, the small ambient noise that fills every moment of life on Earth without you noticing it. That constant acoustic background is something your brain uses to orient itself, to feel connected to a physical world, to register that things are happening around you. On Mars, almost none of that exists. The Martian atmosphere is so thin that sound travels through it at roughly half the efficiency it travels through Earth's air. A large explosion 100 feet away would reach your ears as something closer to a heavy thud than a blast. Human speech at normal conversational volume becomes difficult to understand at distances beyond a few feet on the open surface. The acoustic world of Mars is muffled, compressed, and deeply strange to any human nervous system calibrated to Earth. Inside a pressurized habitat, sound behaves normally because the air inside is at Earth-like pressure. But every surface excursion takes crew members out into the acoustic near silence of the Martian environment, filtered further by suit helmets and communication systems. Everything a crew member hears outside arrives processed through electronics. The natural spatial awareness humans get from ambient sound disappears entirely. This matters more than it might seem. Humans are extraordinarily good at using sound to detect problems before seeing them. A strange vibration in a machine, a pressure leak creating a faint hiss, a structural component under stress producing a low resonance. These are the subtle audio signals that an experienced technician picks up almost unconsciously after months of working around complex equipment. On Mars's surface, those signals vanish into the acoustic noise floor of a nearly airless world. The Perseverance rover carried a microphone to Mars specifically to study this. The recordings it sent back were scientifically fascinating and experientially strange. Sounds that should carry across open space faded within feet. Rover sounds were present, but surrounded by a silence so complete it registered as oppressive to researchers listening to the recordings on Earth. One scientist described it as hearing sounds inside a room where all the walls have been removed, leaving only the objects themselves with no acoustic context around them. Inside the habitat, the acoustic environment carries its own psychological weight. A crew living inside a sealed structure hears the same mechanical sounds every day. The life support systems cycling, the air handlers running, the same specific hum and rhythm of the same machines, every hour, every day, for years. Researchers studying submarine crews and Antarctic winter rover teams have documented a phenomenon where the constant presence of mechanical sound, combined with the absence of natural acoustic variation, produces a form of auditory fatigue where the brain begins filtering out all background sounds aggressively. The danger in auditory fatigue is that it can also filter out sounds that matter. An unusual vibration in a pump, a pressure warning tone that is too similar to a routine system sound, equipment producing a frequency change that signals early-stage failure. A crew whose auditory system has tuned out the background may miss a critical signal embedded in it. Engineers are designing acoustic monitoring systems that continuously analyze habitat sounds and flag anomalies automatically. These systems add a layer of redundancy that compensates for human auditory fatigue, but they also add complexity, add failure points, and add one more system that requires maintenance by a crew already stretched across dozens of responsibilities. The silence outside and the mechanical monotony inside create a sensory environment unlike anything humans evolved to inhabit. And when you place 6 people inside that environment with no way out, the silence stops being just acoustic. It becomes social, and social silence is where the most dangerous breakdowns begin. In 2010 and 2011, a project called Mars 500 ran in Moscow. 6 volunteers spent 520 days inside a series of sealed modules designed to simulate a Mars mission. No real risk. Full medical support outside the walls. Emergency exit available at any point. The simulation was as close to the social conditions of a Mars mission as anyone had safely engineered. The results were sobering. One crew member, by the researchers' analysis, essentially checked out psychologically around the midpoint of the mission. He withdrew from group activities, spent increasing amounts of time in his bunk, and showed measurable declines on cognitive performance tests. His sleep schedule shifted dramatically away from the group schedule, a behavior researchers call social jet lag, where an individual's rhythms desynchronize from the people around them. Another crew member moved in the opposite direction, becoming hyperactive, taking on extra tasks, filling silence with activity in a way that researchers identified as an anxiety response to confinement. The group's social dynamics shifted. Small friction points that would be trivial in normal life became sources of sustained tension when there was no physical escape from them. And this was a simulation. No one was actually on Mars. The modules were in Moscow. The exit was always there. Remove the exit. Add 2 years of actual survival pressure, radiation exposure, food rationing, equipment failures, communication delays, and the physical degradation of low gravity. Place that same group dynamic inside a habitat roughly the size of a large house, divided between 6 people with minimal private space, no ability to take a walk outside for psychological relief, and no natural environment visible anywhere. The research on small group dynamics in extreme isolation consistently identifies the same fault lines. Personality differences that are manageable in open environments become sources of genuine conflict when there is no separation available. Noise sensitivity, sleep schedule differences, communication styles, and personal hygiene standards, things that colleagues on Earth simply tolerate or avoid, become impossible to escape in a sealed habitat. One of the most documented phenomena in confined group studies is the displacement of frustration. When a crew member is angry at a mission outcome, a broken piece of equipment, or a decision from ground control, they frequently cannot express that anger directly. So it redirects toward a fellow crew member over something small, a misplaced tool, an offhand comment, the accumulated weight of minor irritations substituting for the larger frustrations that feel unspeakable. Mission planners are designing conflict resolution protocols, mandatory check-in sessions with Earth-based psychologists, and habitat spaces specifically intended to create psychological separation between crew members, even without physical distance. Private sleeping quarters with lockable doors, separate activity zones, digital privacy options within the shared network. These measures reduce friction. They do not eliminate it. 6 people chosen for extraordinary competence, psychological stability, and team compatibility will still disagree, still irritate each other, still go through periods where the proximity of the same faces every single day produces a form of social exhaustion that no mission training fully prepares anyone for. The hardest part of the social dynamic is also the most invisible. 6 people who genuinely like and respect each other at the start of a mission can still find that same respect worn down by 2 years of total proximity, shared stress, and no variation in social environment. The research calls this contact saturation. You run out of new things to learn about people, conversation loops, silence becomes a shared language, and behind all of it, always, is the awareness that Earth is out there, visible on a clear Martian night as a small blue dot in the sky, close enough to see, impossibly far away to reach. Apollo astronauts looking back at Earth from the Moon described something that became known as the overview effect, a sudden, overwhelming awareness of Earth's smallness and fragility, a shift in perspective so profound that many described it as the most significant moment of their lives. They could cover the entire Earth with their thumb held at arm's length. The planet looked thin, delicate, surrounded by absolute darkness. Most of them were 3 days away from it. A Mars crew looking at Earth sees a bright point of light. On a clear Martian night with no light pollution, Earth is visible to the naked eye as one of the brightest objects in the sky, similar to how Venus looks from Earth. It does not look like a planet. It does not look like home. It looks like a star. The psychological distance that creates is something researchers are only beginning to study. Earth's visible presence has served as an anchor for every astronaut who has ever looked out an observation window on the International Space Station. Even in orbit, hundreds of miles above the surface, the planet below is massive, detailed, rotating visibly, undeniably present. Crew members describe looking at it as comforting, as a physical reminder of what they are connected to. On Mars, that anchor is a pinpoint of light. The connection it provides is fundamentally different, and researchers studying isolated populations believe the psychological effect of that difference may be significant over the course of a multi-year mission. Scientists studying Antarctic expeditions, the closest analog to the psychological experience of planetary isolation, have identified a phenomenon they call Earth out-of-view dissonance. When an isolated person cannot perceive their home environment in any sensory way, disconnection from the concept of home deepens in ways that compound over months. The abstraction of home becomes harder to maintain as a motivating emotional concept when it carries no sensory reality. For a Mars crew, Earth is an abstraction for the entire mission. No one can feel sunlight from Earth's specific latitude. No one smells rain. No one hears wind through trees. The sensory content of home is entirely absent, replaced by the constant sensory content of an alien environment that carries no personal history. Space psychologists are working on what they call Earth connection protocols, regular video messages from family, virtual environments that simulate home locations, access to live feeds from Earth cameras. All of these have shown benefit in isolation studies. They provide partial sensory reconnection to home in ways that help maintain the psychological concept of belonging to a place. But they all carry the same limitation: the communication delay. A video message from a family member describing a moment that happened 20 minutes ago in the past, received in a habitat on a different planet, is a fundamentally different emotional experience from a real-time phone call. The family member who appears on screen has already moved past that moment. Life on Earth has continued without the crew member, and the crew member knows it, and the gap between the lives on both ends of that transmission grows wider with every month of the mission. Some psychologists who study long-duration mission planning describe this as temporal homesickness, a longing not just for a place, but for the version of time that place represents. Home is not static while the crew is away. People age, children grow, relationships change. A crew member returning from a 3-year Mars mission comes back to a home that has moved on in ways that 3 years of delayed communication imperfectly prepared them for. The blue dot in the Martian sky is beautiful, and looking at it, really understanding what it means to be that far from it, is one of the deepest psychological tests any human being has ever faced. The engineering problems around Mars survival can be modeled, tested, and iterated. The interior experience of being 300 million miles from every person you have ever known is something that only the first people to go will fully understand. And while the mind processes that distance, the machines keeping everyone alive are running on power systems with a vulnerability so large that a single weather event can bring them to the edge of failure. A modern city draws power from a massive grid fed by dozens of sources. If one plant goes offline, others compensate. The grid balances itself. People flip on light switches and do not think about where the electricity comes from. A Mars habitat has no grid, no backup plants, no grid to balance against. Every watt of power comes from a finite set of systems that must collectively produce enough to keep 6 people alive in an environment that will kill them if those systems stop. Solar panels are the most intuitive power solution for Mars and the most commonly discussed in mission designs. They are well understood technology, reliable in Earth conditions, and can be produced in large quantities. On Mars, they immediately run into 2 major constraints. The first is sunlight intensity. Mars sits roughly 1.5 times farther from the Sun than Earth does. Solar panels on Mars receive less than half the solar energy per square foot that the same panels would receive on Earth. A solar array that would power a small Earth building needs to be roughly twice as large on Mars to produce the same output, and it still produces that output only during daylight hours. The second constraint is dust. A solar array left unattended on the Martian surface loses efficiency steadily as dust accumulates. The decline is measurable within days and significant within weeks. Without regular cleaning, panels eventually drop below the threshold needed to maintain basic operations. Cleaning panels requires crew time, surface exposure, and mechanical systems that must themselves be maintained. During a global dust storm, both constraints combine into a survival scenario. Reduced sunlight plus heavy dust accumulation can push solar output down to a fraction of normal capacity. A habitat running on solar alone during a multi-week global storm faces cascading power shortages that begin with reduced lighting, progress to heating system limitations, and eventually threaten life support itself. Nuclear power is the engineering answer that most Mars mission scientists privately consider essential for any permanent or long-duration colony. A small fission reactor, similar to systems developed for deep space spacecraft, could provide consistent power independent of sunlight, weather, or dust. The United States and other space agencies have been developing compact fission reactors designed specifically for planetary surface use. The challenges are real. A nuclear reactor on Mars requires specialized handling during setup, produces radioactive waste that must be managed safely in a habitat environment, and adds significant mass to the launch payload. Every additional ton sent to Mars multiplies cost and launch complexity in ways that force genuine trade-off decisions. The difference between a mission design with a reactor and one without can represent billions of dollars and years of additional development. Battery storage bridges the gap in hybrid designs, storing solar energy during the day for use at night. But battery technology at the scale needed for a Mars habitat, with enough capacity to run life support through a Martian night without solar input, represents a significant engineering and mass challenge. The most advanced battery systems currently available would require quantities that add enormous weight to the mission. The power budget on a Mars mission is the resource that everything else depends on. Food production needs power for lighting and systems. Water extraction needs power for heating and electrolysis. Medical equipment needs power continuously. Communication systems need power. Heating needs power. The more systems competing for the same limited supply, the thinner every margin becomes. Mission designers call a situation where power demand exceeds supply a load shed scenario. In a load shed, systems are shut down in order of priority, with life support last. The sequence of what gets turned off first reveals the order in which a mission starts unraveling. Every team that has worked through a Mars load shed simulation has described the experience as clarifying, in the same uncomfortable way that calculating exactly how much time you have before something runs out is always clarifying. The power problem has engineering solutions in development. The medical problem that follows it has solutions that are far less certain. In 1961, a Soviet doctor named Leonid Rogozov was stationed at a remote Antarctic research base when he developed severe abdominal pain. The symptoms were unmistakable: acute appendicitis. Left untreated, a ruptured appendix kills within days. The nearest surgical facility was thousands of miles away. No evacuation was possible. Rogozov performed surgery on himself. He used a local anesthetic, positioned mirrors to see the surgical field, and removed his own appendix over the course of nearly 2 hours. He survived. The story became famous precisely because it represented the outer limit of medical self-reliance, a human being performing a complex procedure on themselves because there was simply no other option. On Mars, that scenario is not a historical curiosity. It is a planning requirement. A crew of 6 people on a multi-year Mars mission will almost certainly face a serious medical event at some point during the mission. The probability calculations are not dramatic speculation. They are based on actuarial data from military deployments, Antarctic expeditions, and submarine missions of comparable duration. Over a 2 to 3 year period, a small group of people will experience injuries from physical work, dental emergencies, appendicitis, or other acute abdominal events, cardiac events in statistically predictable percentages, and the psychological emergencies that come with prolonged isolation. The Mars crew carries a medical officer, typically a physician with additional training in emergency medicine and surgery. This person is responsible for every medical event that occurs. There is no consultation available in real time. The communication delay makes telemedicine a supportive tool rather than a direct intervention capability. The flight surgeon on Earth can review data and offer guidance, but by the time that guidance arrives, the crew member on the ground has already made the first critical decisions. Surgical capability on a Mars mission is deeply constrained. Full surgery requires sterile conditions, specialized instruments, anesthesia, monitoring equipment, blood products for transfusion, and the ability to manage post-operative recovery. A Mars habitat can accommodate a stripped-down version of some of these requirements. It cannot accommodate all of them. The surgical suite designed for Mars missions fits into a compact module and handles a defined range of procedures. Appendectomy is on the list. Complex cardiac surgery is not. A crew member who suffers a serious heart attack, a severe traumatic injury, or a condition requiring specialized surgical intervention outside the mission's medical capability faces a scenario with very limited options. Medication presents a separate challenge. Every pharmaceutical carried on the mission has an expiration date. Drugs carefully selected for the mission's expected medical needs degrade over time. Some medications lose potency relatively slowly and remain partially effective past their listed expiration. Others degrade more quickly. The expiration dates printed on most medications are calculated based on storage in controlled conditions, not in a habitat on Mars where temperature, cycling, radiation exposure, and humidity variations may accelerate degradation. A crew member who needs a specific medication in month 30 of a 36-month mission may be working with supplies that were packed for month 1. The medical officer managing that crew member has to make judgment calls about dosing and efficacy based on whatever testing is feasible with the equipment available. The Rogozov story ends well because he was an exceptional surgeon and got extraordinarily lucky. Mars mission medical planning cannot rely on exceptional luck. It has to build systems that give ordinary crew members in extraordinary circumstances the best possible chance of surviving what would, anywhere else in the human experience, be a hospital emergency. And underneath all of it, beneath every medical calculation, every power budget, every dust particle and radiation count, time itself on Mars runs differently than the clocks in anyone's pocket. A Martian day is 24 hours and 37 minutes long. That 37 minutes sounds like a minor detail. After 2 years on Mars, it adds up to almost 19 full extra days. Time on Mars does not just feel different, it mathematically accumulates differently from any clock humans have ever built their lives around. Mission designers initially approached this as a scheduling problem. They tried keeping crews on Earth time, using 24-hour schedules synchronized to mission control in Houston or wherever the ground team operated. This failed almost immediately during rover missions. Controllers working on Martian time, adjusting their schedules by 37 minutes each day to stay in sync with surface operations, experienced such severe disruption to their sleep and cognitive performance that multiple team members needed medical leave after just weeks of it. The decision for a crewed surface mission is to adopt Martian time completely. The crew lives by the local day, which scientists call a sol. Clocks in the habitat run on sol time. Sleep schedules align to the local sunrise and sunset cycle. The work calendar operates in sols rather than Earth days. The crew, in effect, steps off the Earth time system entirely and adopts an alien one. This creates an immediate and permanent split from Earth. Ground control teams working with the crew have to translate between systems constantly. A crew reporting an event at Sol 47, 1600 hours local Martian time, is describing a moment that does not map simply onto any Earth date. Mission logs, medical records, and operational timelines all run in a dual-time framework that adds cognitive overhead to every administrative task. For the crew members themselves, the shift to Martian time is both practical and psychologically significant. Humans are deeply anchored to Earth time through everything from the rhythm of international communication to the cultural significance of specific dates. A crew member's birthday passes on a day that does not exist in the Martian calendar. Major Earth events happen at moments the crew will hear about hours later, translated into a time system they are no longer living inside. The biological adaptation to the Martian day, as covered in the early chapters of this journey, is also not complete or stable. The 37 extra minutes that the habitat clock runs creates a slow drift between the crew's biology and the local day, even after months of habituation. Some crew members adapt more successfully than others, and the individuals who struggle with the time system tend to show compounding effects on their sleep quality, mood regulation, and cognitive performance. Artificial lighting systems can reinforce the local day cycle by providing strong morning light signals and evening dimming. Meal schedules, exercise routines, and work shifts are designed to anchor the crew's biology to the Martian sol as firmly as possible. But the underlying biological machinery of the human circadian system evolved for a 24-hour cycle over a span of time that makes every Mars mission plan look like a rounding error. Research stations in Antarctica, where crew members live through months of continuous darkness during polar winter, have developed detailed lighting and scheduling protocols that achieve partial circadian stabilization under difficult conditions. Mars mission planners have built on this work extensively. The results are promising enough to be workable, but not so complete as to be comfortable. What makes the time problem stranger than any other challenge the crew faces is that it is invisible. Radiation is invisible too, but it can be measured and responded to directly. Time drift happens in the slow accumulation of off-pattern sleep, in the slight cognitive fog that builds week by week, in the way energy levels peak and trough at slightly different moments each day. By the time the effect is visible in crew performance data, the underlying shift has been building for months, and time on Mars carries one more layer of strangeness that no mission planner introduced, but that every crew member will carry with them. What the crew does on Mars, the choices they make, and the life forms they bring with them may permanently alter a world that has been untouched for billions of years. Every spacecraft ever sent to Mars has been cleaned before launch, surfaces sterilized, components baked in heat chambers, assembly rooms maintained as near-sterile environments. The goal has always been the same. Do not send Earth life to Mars before we know whether Mars has its own. The reason is both scientific and ethical. If Mars harbors any microbial life in its subsurface, in brines, in ice pockets, or in any chemical environment capable of supporting biology, Introducing Earth microbes could contaminate that discovery permanently. A future mission finding bacterial life on Mars would face an impossible question. Did it evolve there, or did we bring it? Worse, competitive Earth microbes could outcompete or destroy native Martian life before it was ever found, identified, or understood. The biological history of a planet, potentially the most significant scientific discovery in human history, wiped out by contamination from the civilization that wanted to find it. The sterilization standards applied to unmanned spacecraft are strict and audited carefully. A robotic lander arriving on Mars carries fewer living microbes than a hospital operating room after full sterilization. But these standards are already difficult to fully achieve, and some Earth microbes are extraordinarily resistant to sterilization processes. Certain bacterial spores survive heat, radiation, and chemical treatments that kill everything else. A human crew sends all of these efforts into a different category entirely. A single human body carries roughly 38 trillion microbial cells, bacteria, fungi, viruses, and other organisms that live in the gut, on the skin, in the respiratory system, and everywhere else biological surfaces exist. These microbes shed constantly. Every breath, every surface contact, every moment of biological existence releases some portion of that microbial community into the surrounding environment. There is no sterilization process for a living human being. The moment a crew steps out of their habitat onto the Martian surface, they begin depositing Earth microbes. Suit seals are not perfect. Airlock systems contain trace contamination despite best practices. Waste systems produce byproducts that carry microbial content. Over a 2-year mission, a 6-person crew will inevitably deposit some quantity of Earth biological material onto Mars, into its soil, potentially into its water ice, and into its atmospheric dust cycle. Scientists and space agencies have been debating the ethical and scientific framework for human Mars exploration for decades. The International Outer Space Treaty and Planetary Protection Guidelines set standards for contamination prevention, but they were written for robotic missions. The guidelines for human missions remain under active debate, precisely because the contamination question has no clean solution. Some researchers argue that the scientific value of finding life on Mars, if it exists, is so high that we should delay human missions until robotic exploration has definitively answered the life question. Others argue that human exploration is necessary to answer that question properly, and that contamination risk must be managed as well as possible rather than used as a reason to avoid going. The crew landing on Mars is already a contamination event in progress. The planet they land on will be measurably different from the one that existed before they arrived. Whatever that difference means for any native biology is something we may never be able to fully calculate, because the measuring instrument, a human research team, is also the source of the contamination. The contamination question points outward toward the planet. The next question points forward across generations, toward the humans who would be born on that contaminated world, and what that world would make of them. Somewhere in the planning documents for long-term Mars colonization, there is a question that most mission designers avoid addressing directly. What happens when someone on Mars has a child? The question is more urgent than it sounds. A permanent Mars colony, by any definition, requires reproduction. A population that cannot sustain itself through birth is a temporary outpost, not a civilization. The long-term vision for Mars settlement requires children born on Mars, raised on Mars, and eventually managing the colony without constant support from Earth. The biology of reproduction in reduced gravity is almost entirely unknown. Studies in low-gravity environments have suggested that cell division, embryonic development, and fetal growth all depend on gravitational cues in ways that are still being mapped. Experiments with animals in microgravity have produced concerning results, including developmental abnormalities in embryos and altered organ formation in fetuses. Mars gravity is higher than the zero gravity of orbit, but whether 38% gravity is sufficient for normal human fetal development is a question with no data yet to answer it. A child who survived development and birth in Martian gravity would enter a world that immediately began shaping their body differently from any human who had ever existed. Growing up in 38% gravity means bones developing under different load conditions. The skeleton would form around movement patterns and forces that match a Martian environment. The cardiovascular system, which must pump blood against gravitational pull, would develop differently. The inner ear, which calibrates balance relative to gravity, would calibrate to a Martian normal. The body that grows up on Mars is, by the time it reaches adulthood, a body optimized for Mars gravity. That body placed in Earth gravity, suddenly bearing 2.5 times its normal gravitational load, would experience that shift as a catastrophic physical stress. The heart that learned to pump against Martian forces may struggle severely against Earth forces. The bones that formed under lighter loading may fracture under the heavier demands of Earth movement. A Mars-born adult might be physically unable to visit Earth, not prohibited by law or logistics, but by the simple physics of a body built for a world with different gravity than the one they are trying to stand on. Legally, the situation is equally uncharted. Under the Outer Space Treaty, no nation claims sovereignty over Mars. A child born on Mars is born in a jurisdiction that does not legally exist. They inherit citizenship of whatever nation their parents hold, but that citizenship describes membership in a political entity on a planet they may never physically visit. The Mars-born generation would be citizens of countries they cannot reach, living on a world that no legal framework has defined, with rights that no court currently has jurisdiction to protect. They would be, in the most literal sense, a new kind of human, physically adapted to a different world, legally stateless in any meaningful practical sense, culturally descended from Earth, but experientially alien to it. The first humans for whom Mars is not an adventure or a mission, but simply home, the only home they have ever known or can ever know. The generation that raises them carries that responsibility on top of everything else Mars demands, and raising that generation will require resources, infrastructure, and systems that push every supply chain and engineering challenge to its absolute limit, including the one that must work perfectly on a specific day or the mission never comes home. Getting off Mars requires rocket fuel, large quantities of it, enough to lift a spacecraft from the surface, accelerate it out of Martian gravity, and push it on a trajectory back toward Earth. The mass of propellant needed for a return trip is enormous, far too much to carry from Earth on the outbound journey without making the launch prohibitively expensive or physically impossible. The solution proposed in most serious Mars mission architectures is to manufacture the fuel on Mars using local resources. The chemistry involved is well understood. Carbon dioxide from the Martian atmosphere reacts with hydrogen to produce methane and water in a process called the Sabatier reaction. The methane becomes rocket fuel. The water is split into hydrogen and oxygen by electrolysis. The oxygen serves as the oxidizer that makes the methane burn. Both products together form a propellant combination that can power a rocket off the Martian surface. The chemistry works. On Earth, in laboratories, this process produces fuel reliably. The challenge is doing it at industrial scale, continuously, on the surface of another planet, with equipment that has never been operated in those conditions before, using power systems that must simultaneously support an entire crew's survival. A proposed demonstration called the Mars Oxygen In Situ Resource Utilization Experiment flew to Mars on the Perseverance rover and successfully produced small amounts of oxygen from the Martian atmosphere in situ resource. 2021. The experiment worked. The scale was roughly the equivalent of a few minutes of breathable air. A return mission needs thousands of times that quantity. The fuel production timeline in current mission designs runs between 12 and 24 months of continuous operation before enough propellant exists to launch the return vehicle. That operation must begin before the crew even arrives, using equipment sent ahead on an unmanned cargo mission. When the crew lands, the fuel production plant is already running. If it is not, the crew has no return vehicle until the plant can be started debugged, and run to completion, adding months to their surface stay with no guarantee of success. Every failure mode in the fuel production chain matters enormously. A clogged filter in the Sabatier reactor, a broken compressor, a power supply interruption during electrolysis. Any of these stops production, which delays the return timeline, which compresses the crew's available launch window, which creates scheduling pressure that radiates through every other mission activity. The hydrogen feedstock for the Sabatier reaction must come from somewhere. In designs using local water ice, hydrogen is extracted by splitting water through electrolysis, then feeding the hydrogen into the Sabatier reactor, while the oxygen is stored separately. This requires the water extraction system, the electrolysis system, and the Sabatier system to all function simultaneously and continuously. Each of those systems has its own maintenance requirements, failure modes, and operational complexity. Engineers running simulations of this fuel production chain describe it as the most operationally complex sustained process in the entire mission profile, more demanding than habitat maintenance, more demanding than food production, and more sensitive to failure than almost any other system because its output is the single resource that determines whether anyone gets home. The fuel is not a backup plan. The fuel is the only plan, and the team producing it is the same team managing everything else on the planet. What if that team loses a member? What if the equipment that keeps the crew alive and the equipment that builds their exit are fighting for the same power supply? The margin between a successful return and a permanent stay is measured in pressure readings, power outputs, and the continued function of machines that have never been tested at this scale on this world before. The machines can be repaired if they break. Some of them, the one thing that cannot be repaired, the one threat that arrives without any mechanical warning at all, comes from the star at the center of the solar system. On September 1st, 1959, a British astronomer named Richard Carrington was drawing sunspots through his telescope when he saw something no one had ever documented before. A brilliant white flash erupted from the solar surface. It lasted only minutes. Carrington described it later as a burst of light so intense he initially assumed something had gone wrong with his equipment. The light reached Earth in 8 minutes, as all light from the sun does. What followed, it arrived roughly 18 hours later. A massive wave of charged particles slammed into Earth's magnetic field with an intensity that had never been recorded before or since. Telegraph systems across Europe and North America failed. Some telegraph operators received electric shocks from equipment that had been disconnected. Auroras appeared as far south as Cuba and Colombia. The event is now called the Carrington Event and remains the most powerful solar storm in recorded human history. Earth's magnetic field absorbed the worst of it. The surface was largely protected. Electrical infrastructure was disrupted, but people were not directly harmed by radiation. The planet's shield did its job. Mars has no equivalent shield. A Carrington-level event hitting Mars would deliver radiation directly to the surface with minimal atmospheric filtering. Based on models scientists have built using data from smaller solar events measured by Mars orbiters, a Carrington-equivalent storm at Mars could deliver a radiation dose in a matter of hours that would cause acute radiation sickness in any unshielded crew member. In the most intense scenarios, the dose could be lethal within days. The warning time is the deepest problem. Scientists monitor the sun continuously using satellites positioned between Earth and the sun. When a major solar particle event erupts, those satellites detect the incoming particle wave and can transmit a warning. Earth receives this warning with enough time, typically 30 minutes to several hours, to allow people in sensitive environments like spacecraft to take shelter. But those monitoring satellites orbit near Earth. Their data transmits to Earth first, and then retransmits to Mars. By the time a warning reaches a Mars habitat, the travel time of that warning signal adds between 3 and 24 minutes depending on the orbital positions. For a smaller, faster particle event, the warning and the particles themselves may arrive nearly simultaneously at Mars. A crew on the Martian surface during a major solar event needs to be inside a shielded area before the radiation peak arrives. The habitat's most protected space, typically a central module surrounded by water tanks or other shielding material, is where crew members shelter during high radiation warnings. Getting from the surface into the habitat and into the shielded core takes time. A crew caught far from the habitat during a rapid onset event faces a genuinely dangerous race against particle physics. Underground habitat designs address this most directly. A habitat built several feet below the Martian surface has meters of regolith, the loose surface soil, providing radiation shielding automatically. The soil that is too toxic to grow food in without processing is, in thick enough layers, an excellent radiation barrier. Several meters of Martian regolith reduce surface radiation exposure by a factor that brings it closer to Earth-level protection. The cost is construction complexity. Building underground on Mars requires excavating equipment, structural reinforcement to prevent tunnel collapse in Martian soil conditions, and engineering for the thermal properties of underground spaces that may run colder than surface habitats. Every solution to one Mars problem seems to introduce two more. And even underground, fully sheltered and shielded, the crew experiences the isolation and monotony of their existence in a way that removes one of the few sensory dimensions still available to them. Even the air they breathe carries a particular quality that no engineer has yet figured out how to fully improve. No one talks about smell in Mars mission planning documents. It is not a survival critical parameter. No safety threshold governs it. No engineering specification addresses it the way pressure and temperature and radiation dose get addressed. And yet, smell may be one of the most psychologically significant aspects of long-duration Mars habitation, precisely because of how completely it changes from anything humans are built to expect. The human olfactory system connects directly to the limbic system, the brain region that governs emotion and memory more immediately than any other sense does. Smell triggers emotional responses and memory recall faster and more powerfully than sight or sound. The smell of a specific food brings a person to a childhood kitchen in an instant. The smell of rain on hot pavement carries an entire season's worth of emotional weight. Humans live inside a rich, aromatic environment on Earth and take it almost entirely for granted. A Mars habitat smells like machinery. The dominant olfactory environment inside a sealed, pressurized habitat is the combination of outgassing from polymers and synthetic materials used in construction, the metallic tang of circulated air running through filtration and life support systems, the chemical undertone of cleaning products and equipment lubricants, and the biological notes of 6 people sharing a sealed space for years. The natural aromatic environment that humans evolved inside, soil after rain, vegetation, open air, the 1,000 small olfactory signals of an outdoor world, is entirely absent. Researchers studying submarine crews on extended deployments describe a process of olfactory adaptation that happens within the first weeks. The brain stops registering the background chemical environment as unusual. The artificial smell of the submarine becomes the new normal. Crew members report that the smell of fresh air experienced when the submarine surfaces is initially overwhelming and almost disorienting after months of absence. On Mars, the adaptation would be similar but more extreme and longer lasting. The habitat's chemical smell becomes the only smell. There is no surfacing, no fresh air, no occasional outdoor exposure to break the monotony. For years, the olfactory environment remains constant and entirely synthetic. Mission designers have begun considering aromatic interventions as part of psychological support systems. The ability to occasionally release controlled amounts of natural aromatic compounds into the habitat air, pine, citrus, rain-scented compounds, laboratory versions of natural smells, has shown measurable positive effects on mood and stress response in controlled studies. These are small interventions. They cost little in mass and power, but they represent an acknowledgement that the full sensory experience of being human matters to mission success in ways that early planning documents entirely missed. The food smell situation is its own dimension of this problem. Cooking natural food produces aromatic compounds that serve a biological function, stimulating appetite, triggering digestive preparation, and providing one of the most reliable mood-enhancing sensory experiences humans access regularly. Freeze-dried and shelf-stable mission food heats up to produce far fewer of these compounds. The olfactory experience of a meal in a Mars habitat is a fraction of what the same caloric intake produces on Earth. Crew members on long space station missions consistently report food as a significant source of psychological difficulty. The absence of the full sensory experience of eating, including aroma, reduces the psychological reward of meals even when the nutritional content is adequate. Over years, this reduction compounds into a sustained background deficit in one of the few reliable daily pleasures available to an isolated crew. The smell of the habitat tells the body it is somewhere foreign, somewhere synthetic, somewhere that is neither natural nor home. Every day, every breath, the sensory system delivers that same message. And in a place where every decision about survival carries weight, the absence of legal structure to govern those decisions adds a different kind of pressure to an already overloaded situation. In 1967, the nations with space programs gathered and produced the Outer Space Treaty. It established a foundational principle that remains in force today. Outer space, including the Moon and all other celestial bodies, is not subject to national appropriation by any nation through any means. No country can claim Mars. No nation can plant a flag and call the land under it their territory. The treaty also established that nations are responsible for the activities of their own spacecraft and nationals in space. A government launching a Mars mission bears responsibility for what its crew does up there. That is the extent of the legal framework currently governing what happens on Mars. It covers almost nothing that actually matters for a human colony. A crew on Mars operates outside every legal jurisdiction that exists on Earth. There is no Martian court to hear disputes. There is no law enforcement to enforce decisions. There is no legal definition of property on Mars, meaning the habitat that took billions of dollars and a decade of engineering to build exists in a legal gray zone where ownership is governed by practical control rather than any recognized title. The crew members themselves retain their home country's citizenship, and technically, their home country's laws travel with them as applicable to their own actions. A crime committed by a crew member of one nationality against a crew member of another nationality exists in a jurisdictional gap that no treaty currently addresses with any specificity. Which law applies? Which court has standing? Which government has the authority to impose a consequence? These questions have been debated in academic and policy circles for years without resolution. They remain unresolved because no human has yet committed a crime on Mars, and the urgency of resolving hypothetical legal frameworks competes with more immediate mission development priorities for the attention of space agencies and governments. The practical reality on a Mars mission is that authority rests entirely with the mission commander. In a legal vacuum, in a survival environment, with a communication delay that makes external intervention impossible in real time, the person in charge is the person with the most authority by default. Mission protocols designate clear command structures. The commander's decisions about resource allocation, crew assignments, and emergency responses are final in a way they would never be in a legal environment with oversight mechanism. This concentration of authority is a practical necessity. It is also a potential source of significant problems if the commander makes decisions that crew members consider unjust, dangerous, or contrary to the group's survival. On a ship at sea, a captain's authority is backed by maritime law, naval tradition, and the knowledge that a port is eventually coming. On Mars, the commander's authority is backed by mission protocol and the physical reality that everyone's survival depends on functional hierarchy. Mission designers are working on crew agreements, legal frameworks negotiated before departure that establish protocols for disputes, resource allocation, and decision-making during disagreements. These function as a kind of constitutional document for the mission, agreed upon when all parties are on Earth and able to think clearly rather than in the middle of a crisis. But agreements made on Earth, under comfortable conditions, by people who are not yet experiencing the psychological pressures of a Mars mission, may prove difficult to adhere to when the reality of the situation presses against the assumptions those agreements were built on. The history of isolated groups creating their own rules under pressure is complicated, and on Mars, there is no appeal process beyond the next communication window to Earth. The legal vacuum of Mars points to a larger truth. Every layer of civilization that humans built on Earth, law, medicine, supply chains, psychology, agriculture, social structure, must be rebuilt from scratch on Mars at a fraction of Earth's resources, with a fraction of Earth's population, under conditions far more hostile than anything civilization originally developed inside. The humans doing that rebuilding will not be the same people who left Earth. Imagine a child born on Mars. Call her the first Martian. She enters the world in a pressurized habitat, breathing recycled air, under artificial light designed to approximate a sunrise she will never see through a window. The gravity that shapes her growing body is 38% of what shaped every human ancestor who ever lived. The world outside her habitat is not a place she can go without a suit. It never has been and never will be. She grows up knowing Mars the way Earth children know their neighborhoods. The Sol cycle is normal to her. The dim orange sky, glimpsed through habitat viewports, is what sky looks like. The recycled air, the mechanical hum of life support systems, the precise daily routines required for survival inside a sealed environment. These are simply the texture of ordinary life. Her body, by the time she reaches adulthood, has adapted to her world in ways that are measurable and significant. Her bones formed under Martian gravitational loads. Her cardiovascular system learned to pump blood against a planet that pulls less than half as hard as Earth. Her vestibular system, which governs balance, calibrated itself to a world where movement requires different physical calculations than Earth demands. She is human. Her genetics are entirely human. Her language, culture, and intellectual development come from parents and teachers who were born on Earth. But her physiology is adapted to a world that is not Earth's, and that adaptation cuts in a direction that matters enormously. Earth gravity would be genuinely dangerous for her. 2.5 times the force her body was built around, pressing down on a skeleton that formed under lighter conditions, would stress her heart, strain her joints, and risk fracturing bones that never carried that load during development. A trip to Earth, the planet she is legally a citizen of, would require medical preparation similar to what Earth-born astronauts need for long missions in the opposite direction. She may be physically incapable of ever going to Earth safely. The planet on her passport is a place she can visit only as a medical project, with months of preparation and no certainty of full tolerance. Earth is a concept for her, something her parents describe, something she reads about and sees in video feeds that arrive 24 minutes after being recorded. It is not a place she can feel. Her social world is the colony. The dozens or hundreds of people sharing the same habitat network are her entire physical community. Every relationship she forms is with someone also trapped in the same survival situation. The social dynamics, the hierarchy, the cultural norms that develop in a closed human community under sustained survival pressure will be unlike anything Earth anthropologists have studied, because no human community has ever formed under these exact conditions before. The culture of the first Martian generation will be shaped by scarcity, by constant mechanical interdependence, by the knowledge that individual failure can cascade into collective death. A society where every person's survival depends on every other person's competence and cooperation develops values around duty, collective resilience, and technical capability that may diverge substantially from the individualistic cultures most of the founding colonists came from. The first Martian generation is not a science fiction concept. It is a consequence of the mission timelines currently under active development. The generation after the first human landing on Mars assuming survival and reproduction, would include individuals born on that planet within a decade of arrival. Planning for their existence, their medical needs, their legal status, and their psychological development requires addressing questions that no generation of humans has ever needed to answer before. And as the colony grows, as the first Martian generation builds families and the colony reaches towards something resembling permanence, the question of what runs the whole operation shifts from human judgment to something more complicated. Here is something that most public discussions about Mars colonization leave out of the headline. The first things to successfully colonize Mars will almost certainly be machines, not because humans lack courage or capability, but because the mathematics of survival on Mars favor automation so heavily that any mission architecture that does not place artificial intelligence and robotics at the center of its operations is likely to fail. The earliest serious mission designs sent entirely robotic systems ahead of human crews. That is not a temporary workaround. Many researchers believe it reflects the permanent operational reality of any Mars colony. The tasks that machines handle without sleep, without psychological deterioration, without caloric needs, without radiation sensitivity, and without the compounding physical degradation of low gravity are precisely the tasks that make or break a Mars colony. Fuel production runs continuously for a year before the crew arrives. Robotic systems do that. Habitat construction on the surface requires work in conditions too dangerous for frequent human exposure. Robotic systems handle that. Surface surveys across hundreds of miles of terrain during the long period before a human crew arrives generate the data that makes the mission possible. Robotic systems, the rovers, are already doing this. Artificial intelligence running the habitat's life support systems can monitor thousands of data points simultaneously, detect anomalies faster than any human crew, and initiate responses to system failures before the crew is even aware something has changed. An AI system managing power allocation during a dust storm, balancing heating, life support, food production, and fuel generation against a declining power budget, is performing a task that would require multiple highly trained specialists working around the clock if attempted by humans alone. Mission designers are moving toward what they call a human-machine teaming model, where the crew works alongside AI systems that handle monitoring, optimization, and routine operational decisions, while humans manage high-level judgment calls, relationship management, and the creative problem-solving that autonomous systems still cannot match. The AI is the crew's most capable crew member in terms of technical performance. The humans provide the contextual judgment and adaptability that no current autonomous system replicates. Some researchers, speaking informally rather than in official publications, go further. They describe the realistic first decade of a Mars colony as one where humans survive primarily because machine systems handle everything they cannot. The crew is essential, skilled, and capable, and still, the machines are the ones running the life support minute by minute, the fuel production day by day, and the habitat systems season by season. This is already the model in use. The International Space Station runs dozens of automated systems that function without crew input. Ground controllers on Earth manage vast amounts of data continuously. The ratio of automated monitoring to human decision-making has only grown over the decades since the first long-duration missions. On Mars, with the communication delay removing ground control from real-time participation, that ratio shifts further toward automation. The crew commands, the machines execute and monitor, the AI flags what requires human attention and handles what does not. A colony that loses its automated systems and falls back entirely on human management of every life-sustaining process is a colony in acute crisis. The machines are not a backup for the humans. In the most honest assessment of what a Mars colony requires to survive, the humans are providing something irreplaceable: judgment, scientific discovery, adaptability to the truly unexpected, and the basic human reason for going in the first place. But the machines are providing everything that keeps the experiment alive long enough for the humans to do their part. All of this knowledge, every danger catalogued, every system designed, every psychological challenge mapped, and still the missions are being planned, the rockets are being built, the timelines are advancing, and the one truth that drives all of it forward is something no space agency has ever quite said plainly. Every danger in this account is real. The radiation accumulates, the bones thin, the dust infiltrates. The fuel must be made from scratch on a toxic planet. The crew will have a psychological collapse around month 14. The launch window allows no early exit. The legal system does not exist yet. The first generation born there may never see Earth. And the missions are accelerating. Space agencies are not accelerating because they solved the problems. They are accelerating because the alternative, waiting until every problem is solved before going, means never going. Every engineer working on Mars mission design knows this. The first mission will go with incomplete solutions, engineering compromises, and biological uncertainties that will only be resolved by the data the mission itself generates. This is how every frontier in human history has worked. The first ocean crossings used ships that were inadequate for the task by the standards of every crossing that came after them. The first flights at Kitty Hawk were dangerous, poorly understood, and operated far beyond what the physics of that era could fully predict. The first people to winter over in Antarctica had no reliable data on what prolonged extreme cold does to the human mind and body, because there was no data until they collected it. Mars is the same pattern, compressed into a generation, because technology and urgency are both moving faster than they ever have before. The urgency comes from a place that space agencies discuss in careful, measured terms in public, but with more directness in internal documents. Earth is a single point of failure. Every species that has ever gone extinct on this planet went extinct because it was only on this planet. A civilization that exists on a single world is a civilization that could end with a single event, an asteroid, a pandemic that moves faster than any response, a climate shift beyond adaptation thresholds, or any number of scenarios that planetary scientists study with professional calm and private concern. Mars is the backup, not a comfortable backup, not a convenient backup, a brutal, expensive, dangerous, deeply imperfect backup that is still, by the mathematics of existential risk, worth the cost. The people who go first know this. The astronauts and engineers and mission designers who are planning to step onto that planet are not unaware of what they are walking into. The physical dangers are documented in detail. The psychological risks are mapped and measured. The engineering compromises are debated openly, and still the training continues. Still the rockets are being built. Still the timelines are advancing. There is one more truth embedded in this, that space agencies acknowledge only obliquely in official communications. The first Mars crew will likely not get everything right. Equipment will fail in ways not anticipated. Solutions will be improvised under pressure from people who were not put in that situation during training. Some objectives will be abandoned in favor of survival. Some of the careful planning will meet the Martian reality and require on-the-spot reinvention. The first Mars mission will be imperfect. It will be dangerous in ways that the second mission will not be, because the second mission will have the first mission's data. The third mission will be safer than the second for the same reason. This is how human beings have always pushed past the boundaries of what they know. By sending someone ahead and learning from what happens, the people who go first are not going because Mars is ready for them. They are going because they are ready to find out whether Mars is survivable at all. And what they find will determine whether the planet with the toxic soil and the lethal dust and the empty sky and the 200-degree daily temperature swings and the radiation pouring down without pause becomes something extraordinary. A second home, built at enormous cost, paid for by the people brave enough to go first and honest enough to know exactly what they were walking into. Every space agency on Earth has a public Mars program. They release timelines, they announce milestones, they publish mission architectures with confident names and carefully worded objectives. The language is optimistic, forward-leaning, built to inspire funding and public support. Behind that language, buried in technical review documents and internal risk assessments that rarely make news cycles, is a calculation that nobody in an official capacity states plainly. The first human Mars mission has a meaningful probability of not coming home. Meaningful does not mean certain. The engineers building these missions are brilliant, meticulous, and deeply motivated by the goal of bringing their crew back safely. The probability of failure drives every redundant system, every safety margin, every contingency protocol in the mission design. But the honest math, when every failure mode is stacked against every mitigation measure, produces a number that is not zero. And that number is higher than any mission since the earliest days of human spaceflight. The Apollo program carried risk that would be considered extraordinary by modern standards, and the agencies running it knew it. Internal NASA documents from the 1960s show risk assessments that were far more sobering than the confident public communications of the era. NASA Administrator Sean O'Keefe, speaking decades later about the culture of that period, described a general understanding that some missions would likely be lost in the process of reaching the moon. The goal was considered worth the cost. The crews who went understood the stakes. Mars is that calculation multiplied. The distance makes every problem harder. The communication delay removes real-time support for every crisis. The launch window removes the evacuation option. The fuel production requirement means the return vehicle is built on Mars by the same crew trying to survive there. The radiation, the dust, the toxic soil, the temperature extremes, the psychological collapse, the bone loss, the medical vulnerability, every layer compounds every other layer in ways that are difficult to model precisely because the interactions between simultaneous stressors have never been observed in this combination before. What space agencies are moving toward, and discussing more openly than they did 5 years ago, is a framework called acceptable mission risk. The term itself is revealing. The mission carries risk. Some of that risk cannot be engineered away. The question becomes whether the risk is acceptable in proportion to the scientific, strategic, and existential value of going. For many of the people inside these programs, the answer is yes, and not reluctantly. The researchers and engineers who have spent careers working toward Mars understand better than anyone what the mission will cost and why it still needs to happen. The species-level argument, the one about Earth as a single point of failure, does not arrive as a comforting abstraction for them. It arrives as a concrete professional motivation. Getting humans to Mars and keeping them alive long enough to build a foothold is one of the most important engineering problems in human history. The crews who will go first are not going because someone assured them the mission is safe. They are going because they have seen the full picture. Every danger catalogued across every chapter of what survival on Mars actually demands. And they have decided that the thing waiting on the other side of that danger is worth the price of going. The first people on Mars will step onto a world that has no air they can breathe, no ground they can touch without protection, no sky that will not irradiate them, no soil that will not poison crops without years of work, no communication with home that does not arrive in the past, and no rescue within range of any possible emergency. They will also step onto a world that no human being has ever stood on, a world where every footprint is the first, where every discovery is genuinely new, where the science being done cannot be replicated anywhere else, by any other means, at any other time in the current era of human capability. The danger is real, every part of it is real, and the people going anyway have looked at that danger longer and more carefully than anyone, and they are still going. That is the one truth the press releases do not quite capture. The mission to Mars is not a confident stride into a conquered frontier. It is a deliberate, eyes-open walk into the most hostile environment any human being has ever attempted to inhabit, undertaken by people who know exactly what they are walking into and have decided that knowing is not a reason to stop. The planet is waiting, the rockets are being built, and somewhere right now, the people who will go first are already in training for a journey that will either expand what humanity is capable of or teach the next generation what to do differently. Either way, we are going.